Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining today's on-the-record discussion in which we'll discuss Syria's war on drugs. Syria's 14-year civil war turned Captagon production from a small-scale criminal operation into a multi-billion-dollar industry that benefited militias, criminal networks, and most notably, the heavily sanctioned Assad regime. The Captagon trade poses serious threats to regional security, fueling addiction and transborder trafficking across Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and the Gulf. Since the toppling of the Assad regime, Syria's new government has taken on the task of battling and dismantling the Captagon drug empire. How successful can we expect the new authorities to be? To help us answer that question and more, we are joined by Charles Lister and Caroline Rose. Charles is a senior fellow with MEI and the director of its Syria Initiative. He has recently returned from Damascus, which means he'll be sharing a lot of his firsthand insight with us today. And Caroline is the director of the Crime Conflict Nexus and Military Withdrawals portfolio at the New Lines Institute, where she researches the intersection of defense, security, illicit trades, and geopolitical landscapes. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Sure, thanks for having us, Zaina.
Yes, thank you so much, Zaina. It's great to be here.
Before we get started, the usual housekeeping items. We'll have a Q&A segment during the session, so if you'd like to ask your question, please either type it in the Q&A chat box here on Zoom or use the raise hand function, and when selected, we'll unmute you, and you could direct your question to our panelists. Let's get started. Caroline, why don't we start with the basics? What is Captagon, the drug little known outside the Middle East, and what role has the Assad regime played in sponsoring this industry?
It's a great question. So Captagon is an amphetamine-type stimulant that in the 1960s to mid-1980s was a illicit drug available on the pharmaceutical market, then phased out and it became an illicit drug, first primarily in Europe and the Balkans. And then over the years, from the early 2000s to mid-2010s, it started to incrementally move its way into the Middle East, particularly in the Levant. Around that time also, there were identified destination markets, otherwise known as consumption hubs, primarily in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the GCC. The reason why Captagon became a very popular substance, especially in the Middle East, was because it had a illicit history. It was used to treat ADHD, sometimes used as a weight loss aid. And on top of that, it was something that had many different uses. So you could use Captagon to stay up at night. You can use it for recreation, but also you could use it to stave hunger. You could also use it to stay up and be productive for exams. So for example, it was very popular amongst university students, truck drivers, taxi drivers, and it was very cheap to make. And Captagon is very emblematic of this surge in synthetic drugs that we've seen not only across the international community, but specifically in the Middle East, because it does not require land, it does not require immense staffing, it does not require many resources. And so as a result, you can make this on a small scale, or you can scale it up to industrial scale production and manufacturing. During the Syrian civil war, we first saw Captagon emerge. Of course, there were small laboratories before in the early 2000s, especially in the Kalamoun mountain range along the Lebanese and Syrian border. But during the Syrian civil war, that provided the prime conditions for a drug trade like Captagon to thrive. Easy to make, cheap, and on top of that, multiple uses that made it attractive to many different consumers. For example, if you're waiting in a bread line, or if you are facing food or income insecurity, Captagon is seen as a very lucrative drug because it allows you to get through the day. For those who had experienced trauma, also Captagon, if used frequently and consistently, can sometimes induce psychosis. It can induce a feeling of euphoria. So many people who were traumatized by the civil conflict also were attracted to Captagon. And then also Captagon became a very attractive battlefield aid as well. A lot of soldiers used Captagon to enhance battlefield performance, feelings of invincibility, feelings of bravery. And so as a result, we saw Captagon used by armed factions at first across the board. Then in the mid-2010s, we started to see it somewhat associated with the Islamic State. There were signs of small-scale production, also reports of consumption, though it's not necessarily determined just how involved the Islamic State was in the Captagon trade, because in the late 2010s, we started to see large-scale signs of regime involvement in the Captagon trade. And when I say involvement, I really mean sponsorship over industrial scale production and manufacturing. Around 2017, 2018, we started to see numbers like we had never seen before in the Captagon trade. Seizures of Captagon went from just a few hundred or 1,000 pills to hundreds of thousands of pills, if not millions. We also started to see Captagon, just pop up across the map, not only in the Middle East, but also across the Mediterranean and Southern Europe, in some cases in mainland Europe, as well as far-flung locations like Malaysia, for example. They were using industrial scale tools and also very sophisticated transportation methods, such as shipping containers. They were also coordinating with external international criminal syndicates. And at its peak, which was around 2022 to 2023, the Captagon trade was estimated to provide at least $2.4 billion for just the regime's primary security apparatus. There are many reasons why the regime resorted to illicit drug production during this time. They needed alternative revenue, but also importantly, I think the Assad regime was at that time still fragmented and weak, and they needed a way to pad the pockets of their patronage system. So this was a way that kept the cousins happy. It kept the primary business partners and key influential figures within the regime's key security apparatus funded, happy, and able to fund their activities, both through the security sector as well as the business sector of Syria. And I'll leave it there.
I do want to just follow up on the value of the Captagon trade and how much it generated revenue for the Assad regime, but also the Captagon trade in general is estimated at $10 billion. So how does that compare to like Mexico's drug trade or other drug trades around the world?
It's much smaller than other international drug trades. And also I think it's important to note that Captagon primarily is consumed and popular in the Middle East and North Africa. We're starting to see some signs of its spillover. But unlike other international drug trades, Captagon still is quite regionally contained. At its largest, which was in 2023, as you mentioned, estimated to be around 10 billion. We run a comprehensive seizure database over at the New Lines Institute, and we have a project dedicated to Captagon. And we did find that in 2024, there was a slight downturn in the volume of Captagon circulated in the illicit market as well. But at the same time, the incidence of seizures had increased that year. So the value of Captagon certainly slid in 2024. And after the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024, of course, it's a whole new picture in terms of the value of Captagon and, of course, how it's circulated in the illicit market.
Charles, let's fast forward to today, with the Assad regime now fallen and Syria's current interim president publicly vowing to end the Captagon trade. Where does the illicit drug trade in Syria stand today?
So good question. I mean, I would loosely describe it as in flux. I mean, clearly, as one of the most kind of potent illustrative symbols that came to represent the regime in its latter years. And of course, given the fact that Ahmad al-Shara and his sort of immediate movement and circle come from a more conservative religious background, for both of those reasons, combating the drugs trade was an immediate priority right from day one. So both from a kind of ideological societal perspective, but also given the fact that it so came to symbolize what the regime represented to so many people, it became a really significant security priority as soon as the regime had fallen. So I think what we have seen, develop in the 9-10 months that have followed, is probably two different sort of stories or two different paths. One, domestically, is the prioritization of combating the production of Captagon. So I had a nearly 3-hour meeting with Interior Minister Anas al-Khattab when I was in Damascus, and that was how he basically described it. Their number one priority was first combating the production of Captagon on Syrian soil, and his assessment is that that has more or less now been accomplished. And I would argue, and we can maybe tackle that maybe there are some exceptions to that rule, given the fact that Syria remains divided, the government is not in control of all of the territory. But I think by and large, what we do appear to be seeing now in the second phase of that Ministry of Interior-led campaign against drugs is, whereas the first maybe 4 to 6 months, we were seeing production facilities being seized, large quantities of precursor chemicals being seized. Now, the vast majority of seizures, if not almost all, in the past 2 to 3 months, have been drugs that have been hidden, concealed, buried, stored in buildings for trafficking and smuggling elsewhere. And that would seem to suggest that, the direction or the emphasis of that counter-narcotics campaign has shifted from targeting production to targeting storage and trafficking. And again, one of the things he said was when they came in, their intelligence suggested, he was quite open in saying that we've totally infiltrated the drugs trade inside Syria, and there are people telling us things every day. His assessment was there was a gigantic quantity of drugs that had previously been produced and were literally buried in the ground all across Syria, to basically sustain this trade long term. And again, that is what we have certainly seen in the last few weeks, is a whole bunch of huge seizures of drugs that were literally buried in fields. And so that's the domestic story. Then I think there's a kind of more regional one to tell, which is that the Ministry of Interior, I would argue on a security level, the Ministry of Interior has done the best job in terms of becoming a cohesive, effective, and quite professional security structure within this transitional government in Syria, far beyond what the MOD looks like, which is very much more piecemeal and factional. And in that sense, they have done a very good job at establishing very close coordinating relationships with the regional states who suffer from Syria's drug trade, with some exceptions. The closest relationship is almost certainly now with Jordan in terms of everyday operational coordination. And almost every 2 or 3 days now, we're seeing a variety of different seizures that come as a result of some level of Jordanian and or Syrian action. But also the relationships with Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar with the MOI, with the Ministry of Interior, have come on a very, very long way. And of course with Turkey, which was just before Assad's fall, and interesting to hear what Caroline thinks on this, was a real new front line of large-scale drug smuggling and trafficking was all along the Turkish border. There was a good deal on the Iraqi border, but the seizures that were happening on the Turkish border, I think, seemed much bigger in scale. And so, of course, that relationship has continued. And as a result of that, to widen the conversation beyond just the drugs trade and combating drugs, the institutional relationship between the MOI and Qatar and Saudi Arabia in particular has become much, much closer. And so there is now financial assistance, training assistance outside of Syria for Ministry of Interior personnel, particularly in the counter-narcotics area, but also in the counterterrorism forces. That's not a public thing, but those two Gulf states in particular have really taken ownership of the Interior Ministry, and it has had a really positive effect in terms of the capabilities on the ground, the ability to coordinate with other nation states. Last couple points is to emphasize that point that Syria is still a divided country. The two big, what I call unresolved territorial issues, 25% roughly of Syria held by the SDF in the northeast, but perhaps even more importantly, Sweden now being controlled by this de facto kind of loose network of several dozen Druze militias, means that there are areas that are not necessarily completely ungoverned, but certainly there are areas of Syria where there are not dedicated counter-narcotics forces conducting the kind of intensity of operations that the transitional government is. And certainly since the huge and horrific violence that we saw in Sweden in July, that was the turning point for Sweden. That was the point at which we have seen these kind of de facto authorities take control inside Sweden, and this National Guard of Druze militias that they call it. Since the end of July, there has been a more than 400% increase in drugs trafficking incidents along the Jordanian border with Sweden. So there is a direct correlation to draw between that assumption of power by these Druze militias. And I should argue that more than half of their National Guard leadership in Sweden are former Assad regime officers and a bunch of brigadier generals, some of whom previously had outstanding Interpol red notices for involvement in transnational organized crime and drug trafficking. So there is a direct correlation to draw between those kind of unresolved territorial issues, which tells you that Syria is still along a path here. And it's not all a perfect, clean story, depending on where you look. Let me close that. I'll close out there. Certainly, there's more to be said on that, but I'll close out there on the big picture.
I actually have already a follow-up question for you on that front. First, let's open the floor to questions. Please type them in the Q&A chat box or use the raise hand function, and we'll unmute you and you'll ask your questions to both of our panelists. We have a question from Christoph Reuter. Charles, could you give us more details about the current Captagon smuggling networks? Who brings the drugs into Jordan? Are they run by Druze, Bedouins, or a mix of both factions? You touched on the Druze front, but
yeah. So again, interested in Caroline's views on this too, because she's tracked it just as if not more closely than me. But I think in the past, the drugs trade in Sweden was run by Bedouin tribes, often in some form of coordination with Druze militia actors. I mean, Sweden has a very wide spectrum of different Druze armed actors. We're in a very rare occasion since July where they have appeared to be more or less united, but zoom back 5 or 10 years, and there are deep divisions within the Druze militia kind of community, so to speak. And so the Bedouins in controlling a lot of the much more rural, unpopulated territories, were their key kind of the key segue into the trafficking industry. But what's been interesting is that since July, nearly 70% of the Bedouin community of Sweden has been displaced. And so it's very hard to get direct insight into that area now, much harder than it was earlier in the year. And I spent time in Sweden earlier in the year and was able to ask and speak with a whole bunch of different Druze militias about this and get very different opinions depending on who I was talking to. But it would seem to be the case now that, and this is just my assumption, that some of those Druze militias that had those more historical relationships through Syria, Assad's military intelligence directorate, which was, again, the key player in Sweden in terms of driving the drugs trade, have now assumed not just security responsibility, but I think taken over some of that trafficking activity. And so whereas we used to hear about human beings running at the border with drones flying over and all kinds of other sophisticated diversionary tactics, since July, we've suddenly seen the dominance of these kind of heavy lift balloons now that carry anywhere between 20 and 50,000 Captagon pills at a time, and they're just flying them towards Jordan. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen the tactics completely change when that dynamic shift happened in July. The Bedouins were displaced by a vast majority, and these Druze militias have suddenly taken over. I don't think, again, there's clearly a direct correlation in the huge spike in drug trafficking activity, but I think there's also a direct correlation in terms of the dramatic change of tactics that we have seen.
Caroline, anything to add?
Definitely. I completely agree with Charles in the sense of, just backing up as well, looking at the overall counter-narcotic strategy. I like to think of it in 3 phases, and we're in the 3rd phase right now, which is still incomplete. The first one I like to characterize as this kind of slash and burn approach with the obvious large-scale laboratories as well as the storage sites. This is when, especially I'm sure many will remember in December and January, you had in some cases community members, because they were so aware and so suspicious of some of these sites, going out into the streets and seizing the drugs themselves, in some cases throwing it down the street drains or, tipping off HTS forces. And this was very much a community as well as law enforcement joint initiative. Then we started to see a second phase, which was much more sophisticated, but still building up momentum. And it was what I like to call the countering the big fish in the Captagon trade. And this actually is characterized by a string of arrests. And we started to see this in the spring. It was after the violence in Latakia, which I believe delayed the new administration's approach to trying to go after former regime aligned as well as regime officials implicated in Captagon. But this is a very interesting and in some cases impressive campaign where they conducted a string of arrests with high-profile regime traffickers and producers. Individuals like Wassim Badia al-Assad, which a year ago, if you had said that he was arrested for Captagon trafficking and production, that would have been an incredibly, almost unbelievable feat. They worked with Lebanese forces to bring him from Tripoli back into Syrian territory, where he believed he was going to be able to dig up a series of gold bars that he dug underneath a farm right outside of Damascus. And they used a double agent to lure him back into Syria, where they conducted his arrest. There's another arrest and another case that I think is also very interesting as well as important, and it shows this increasing capacity amongst the Interior Ministry and Anti-Narcotics Directorate. And it is the arrest of Amr al-Sheikh, who initially, and this all comes back to Suwaida, as Charles was just saying, he initially fled to Suwaida, then went into Iraq, and then went into Turkey. The Syrian Interior Ministry collaborated with both Baghdad as well as Ankara to try and share intelligence and tip-offs and conduct his arrest. But that also shows that we're starting to see this consolidation, some of these pockets of safe havens that either former regime members or regime-aligned individuals or even lone wolves, they're now flocking to as a way to engage in both trafficking and production. And so now we're reaching this 3rd phase, which is very much an unfinished, incomplete phase, which is going after the remnants as well as the independent networks that now want to seize upon and capitalize on this opportunity where there's a Captagon shortage. There is an increase in prices as a result. And so it's a very lucrative industry to engage in. That's why we've seen an increase in activity in Suwaida, the inability for the Interior Ministry as well as the government at large to reach these networks in Suwaida. We've seen some increased activity in Dara recently, but it's not in Suwaida. And a lot of these networks have now fled to Suwaida to engage in production and trafficking. The scale of production is nowhere near what we saw during the regime era. I don't think we'll ever see that scale, at least in the next 5 years, at least inside of Syria or the Levant. We could see it in other places like Yemen. But ultimately, it's smaller scale production, but they're trying all to fill in this vacuum that the regime had left behind. In terms of the actors, the Al-Karama militia, which moved against the regime, but also worked with the regime and was co-opted by the 4th Armored Division, they're very much engaged. Families like the Ramthan family, the Falhut family, The Mazar family, they're all still engaged in smuggling. And these are families that over generations had engaged in illicit cigarette smuggling, fuel smuggling, weapons. And also, of course, as Charles mentioned, Bedouin militias as well, which sometimes would cooperate with the Druze, but then, of course, also compete. Another area that actually two more areas that I think deserve further attention by the administration, but are still areas that they can't quite contest in. One is the Syrian-Lebanese border. We saw some clashes actually in February and March, and some quite bold behavior, both by the Lebanese security forces as well as the Syrian security forces, where there were a few Zaiter family members and Jafar family members that were killed in clashes. These are notable families when it comes to drug smuggling that had very strong relationships to Hezbollah as well as the 4th Armored Division and Assad family. And then the other area, of course, is northeast Syria. And that is a huge corridor for trafficking into Iraq using the Al-Qaim highway, and it's a very porous border. And of course, there is both small-scale production and large-scale trafficking operations along that border. And that's an area right now that the administration does not feel confident and does not feel emboldened to push the boundaries and push the envelope there and crack down on illicit drug activity.
So many questions, understandably so. Let's start with a question for you, Caroline. How much of the Captagon trade has been intended for the domestic Syrian market, and how much is trafficked abroad? Which countries served as the main destinations and markets for Syria's Captagon trade during Assad's rule, and how has that pattern evolved today?
This is a tricky question because unfortunately there has been no comprehensive consumption study or survey on consumption. There was an incredible report that was done just about a year and a half ago by Med Global, where they were able to isolate a certain area in opposition held Syria to try and see what the level of Captagon consumption was, as well as with other drugs like methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine. And they did find that Captagon was a very popular substance, as with other synthetic drugs. Unfortunately, we don't have a comprehensive picture for all of Syria. We do know that during the regime, Captagon was very accessible to the point where, there were widespread reports of Syrians being able to go into pharmacies and over the counter purchase a few Captagon tablets. Additionally, there were reports of the 4th Armored Division, especially when it was unable to pay the salaries of some of its soldiers. There were reports that they compensated their soldiers with a few Captagon tablets per day. It was also a very creative way of trying to bypass feeding their soldiers because it staved hunger and allowed them to stay up very late. So it's very clear that Captagon was a common drug, but it by no means was as popular as what we saw in the Gulf. In Saudi Arabia, Captagon is much more popular. It is used amongst youth as well as adults as well, and it's used across the board, across different demographics. That continues to be the case, and we can see some signs that prove that this remains to be the primary consumption market, given the fact that we've seen an overspill in production after the fall of Assad, and that has moved into Sudan. It's moved right next door to Saudi Arabia in Yemen. We've seen now 2 lab seizures in Yemen. We've seen more labs pop up in 2024 in Kuwait, also considered a doorway into the Gulf, as well as some labs that were identified in Iraq. So I think that what we're ultimately seeing is now that the regime's monopoly on Captagon has been essentially suspended, a lot of these traffickers are now questioning why should I stay in Syria, especially if there is a crackdown by the new administration? Why don't I head into new pockets where there is either lack of governance or insecurity or an ongoing civil war, where there's a less of a threat of interdiction, and I can engage in either small scale or medium scale Captagon production. So that's why we've seen kind of this move either into Iraq, into the Gulf, or across the Red Sea into Sudan or next door in Yemen.
Very interesting. We have a question from Marissa Karma. Marissa, if you could just please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much, guys. This is super helpful, and I've been obviously following this work. I did not hear you talk about Israel's role, coordination with the Israelis, particularly in Suwaida. Are we seeing consumption there too? Like, it's just interesting that there's, obviously huge markets in the Gulf, and I've been hearing from even professors in Kuwait saying that they're noticing higher consumption with, amongst students, but I haven't heard about the sort of Western side. But particularly, like, how is Israel approaching this, and who are they coordinating with other than the Jordanians? Thank you.
All right. Charles, can we start with you, and then we'll go to Caroline?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to say it's one thing that well, there's been a ton of rumors over the years, but not an awful lot that's ever been confirmed, which is sort of part of the problem. The rumors have said that there have been several alleged Israeli seizures along the Jordanian border, in particular of Syrian Captagon. That's probably true. But clearly Israel has a lot more of a border control capacity than some of these other states. Certainly in the past along the Jordanian border, and I do think this has been fixed now, but in that earlier peak years that Caroline was describing earlier, there was unquestionably a significant challenge with corruption, quite frankly, along the Jordanian border, in which huge shipments were simply being flagged through by corrupt border guards. When this became such a problem, clearly the Jordanians have I think dealt with that issue. That's not something that I think we have seen on the Israeli border, and I don't think it's something we're likely to see for all the obvious reasons, Marissa, that you're aware of. So I don't think this is a huge problem from the Israeli perspective. It's clearly something that they have had on their radar. But I don't think we've seen a lot of substantiated evidence to suggest that, apart from perhaps the occasional smaller scale incident, that there's anything that's either significant enough in scale or sustained enough over a period of time to suggest this is a strategic challenge to Israel's security.
Caroline?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You have one irony in the sense that Israel is already a hub for synthetic substances. MDMA, for example, is one of them. So on one hand, while there is certainly popularity and demand for synthetic drugs, especially amphetamine-type stimulants like Captagon, there are other more competitive synthetic substances that exist on the market. So as a result, we haven't necessarily seen a flood of Captagon inside of Israel. There have been some reported seizures, very, very few, of Captagon inside of Palestinian territories. But it's not even close to the numbers that we've seen circulated elsewhere in the Levant or in the greater Middle East. And during the outbreak of the war in Gaza, there have been reports of fighters using Captagon, but the evidence is very, very, very slim. And usually the photo evidence or video evidence that they'll use is clearly of other substances like heroin or cocaine, or like liquid methamphetamine instead of Captagon. We don't really see Captagon in liquid form, and so that's very, very rare. And that very much, I think, is contributed to this narrative about Captagon, as well as other amphetamine-type stimulants and narcotics in general, that it can sometimes be used exclusively in a war-fighting context. So we saw, especially after October 7th, there were a lot of reports that Hamas was using Captagon, but those reports are very unsubstantiated, just like what we saw as well with all these reports that ISIS was using Captagon all the time on the battlefield. It's very difficult to prove.
All right, we have a question from Dr. Zahir Sahlul, the head of Med Global.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Caroline and Charles and Zaina, for this important topic. My question is related to the fact that the ship has already sailed. That whenever you create an addiction crisis, and the study that Caroline mentioned that we've done with the Al-Hiwar Center in 2022, actually, the study was done, showed that about 25 to 30% of young men in particular, whether it's in the at that time regime-controlled area or the liberated area at that time, were hooked on on Captagon and also other drugs. And I think the problem with Captagon, from a medical perspective, it's not a very harmful drug, except the fact that it is addicting drug. And there's very minimal resources to treat addictions in Syria. But also it's a gateway to other more dangerous drugs, like crystalline meth, H-booze in Syria, and others, heroin and painkillers, which is some of the more popular drugs in Syria. When I was in Syria in the last few months, I asked people in Homs and Halab and Damascus about drugs, and they say it's everywhere, especially in public schools and universities. So it's a very common phenomenon. The demand is high. The resources are very minimal. There's only one drug rehabilitation center. Yes, we focus on security issues, especially in terms of exporting the drug to other countries, but we're not focusing as international community about treating the supply, the demand, and the fact that we have many young people who are addicted now to Captagon and other and drugs, and there's very minimal resources to address that issue.
Absolutely. Caroline, would you like to add?
Yeah, I completely agree. And Captagon is it's such a tricky substance from a public health standpoint, because unlike methamphetamine, where you have methadone-based treatment, Captagon can primarily be addressed through psychotherapy. Then on top of that, you have a lot of hesitation, cultural stigma with drug abuse and drug usage that prevents people from even seeking help in the first place. So, you know, and then on top of that, you add the context of Syria or the Levant in general, where there is not enough investment and not enough resourced public health facilities to even provide psychotherapy in the first place, as well as other treatments for other illicit drug use and abuse. So as a result, I mean, it's a very broken picture. And I think that when we talk about solutions to this overall problem, moving beyond just the security landscape and the counter-narcotics approach, which we have seen, and it's been effective to the point of disrupting these facilities and the physical production of Captagon and trafficking of Captagon. But at the end of the day, the problem is still going to exist and persist if there is demand, and also if there are socioeconomic conditions that compel individuals or networks to produce this or consume this in the first place. So, you know, the Captagon dilemma, the methamphetamine dilemma, the illicit drug dilemma in the region, I think is very much a socioeconomic issue. Syria, if it improves its economic health, if it improves its public health sector, that is, I think, one of the biggest tools it has to combat Captagon demand, as well as Captagon production and illicit activity in the country. And you know, that opens the door to a broader conversation about the socioeconomic landscape in Syria and the greater Levant.
Charles, I do want to talk about narco diplomacy.
Okay.
What role did the Captagon trade play in ending Bashar al-Assad's isolation in 2023? And when we're talking about today as well, what impact is the current government having, their efforts are currently having on Gulf states specifically?
Yeah, it's a good question. Narco diplomacy in reverse, in a way. I think yes. I mean, unquestionably, the pressure that huge macro scale Captagon smuggling towards the Gulf played in terms of pressuring the Gulf into adopting different foreign policy positions vis-a-vis Syria, I think is unarguable. This was Assad's kind of age-old tactic. You know, rewind 10, 15 years, he was exporting jihadists as a source of pressure on Lebanon, on Iraq, on the US and others. And fast forward 10, 15 years, it was drugs with a new faucet that he could turn up and turn down depending on how much pressure he wanted to put on his rivals and his enemies. So unquestionably, to the extent to which, you know, Bashar himself could control or influence this trade, it was a tool of coercion. And yes, amongst other challenges that the region faced from Syria's ongoing crisis, drugs were clearly a significant one that convinced the Saudis in particular that, you know, something had to give. Now, it wasn't that the Saudis had decided that Bashar al-Assad somehow had, you know, was a changed man and was worth embracing, but it was the calculation at the time that the West, so to speak, was doing very little when it came to trying to change the equation on Syria, let alone generate meaningful diplomacy. And so the only other path was to engage and see if that could change the equation. And, you know, obviously, as Caroline wrote about a lot of the time, and as I sort of said in different settings, the regime spoke the right kind of language. You know, let's cooperate, let's share intelligence, let's work to counter the drugs trade. You know, they made a bunch of fantastical claims about how many hundreds of thousands of people they'd arrested, which was, you know, laughable, you know, statistically. But in reality, they did almost nothing to really meaningfully cooperate with any of the region to combat the drugs trade. And the rest is history. I do think there's a whole nother interesting analytical, you know, piece to be said about the effect that the drugs trade had on actually weakening the regime. I think, you know, Caroline told, I think, half of the story, but the other half is that why did the drugs trade suddenly surge in the early 2020s? And there's a direct correlation you can draw between the fiscal financial crisis in Lebanon, the effect that that had on Syria's ability to acquire the access to the US dollar, and the transformative effect that had on that kind of economic elite under Assad, both on the economic realm, business realm, political realm, and security realm, that previously depended on semi-legitimate business interests that Bashar basically allowed them and empowered them to embrace and make money and become wealthy, suddenly being crippled by the fact that they had no real access to the international economic market and to the US dollar. And so suddenly drugs became a replacement to those semi-legitimate business interests. And that basically, over a number of years, in my view at least, eroded, if not removed, the direct ties of loyalty that that entire elite had previously had to Bashar and his ability to empower them financially. And suddenly drugs and organized crime took over. And it just so happened that from 2020 until the end of 2024, no armed actors in Syria sought to challenge the regime in a really serious way. It took, you know, nearly 5 years for anyone to seriously try and challenge the regime. And finally, we had evidence that, amongst other issues, organized crime had really crippled the regime's ability to count on the loyalty of such a wide spectrum of different actors to stand behind it. And we saw the effect. In 10 days, everything came falling down. Also, just on the public health piece, I think, you know, Dr. Zaha's point is really key here. And I think Caroline, you know, Caroline's remarks perfectly encapsulated the huge long-term public health challenge that Syria will face. But I think it also just tells us an even deeper story, which is in Syria, the smuggling industry dates back decades and decades and decades. I mean, anyone who visited Syria before 2011 will know that every single taxi, basically, that traveled across a border, more often than not, also carried some form of other substance, cigarettes or drugs or any other things that were being smuggled across the border. It was completely institutionalized. Dealing with that deep history doesn't just go away because Bashar al-Assad left. That sort of smuggling instinct and trade along all borders is going to be a long-term challenge for Syria and its neighboring countries to deal with, because of course it's not unique to Syria. It also exists in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq, and all of the other neighbors too. And so there is that not just public health challenge that will take many, many, many years to deal with, but the way that borders are controlled, the way that people who live along borders see those borders as a potential source of revenue has to change. And so that is going to be a very, very long-term challenge to deal with. And that's before we tackle the reality that the humanitarian crisis in Syria today is still worse than it's ever been. And so people kind of forget that that hasn't just fixed itself because Bashar has left. Humanitarian funding for Syria is lower than it's ever been, and humanitarian needs remain as high as they've ever been. And whilst that continues to be the case, things like drugs will always have a window open for access to society. And again, that's going to take very many years for the humanitarian and economic crisis to be resolved. That's not something I think that the population really recognize. When they see sanctions being lifted here, there, and everywhere, there is an expectation that in 3 months' time, the economy is going to be fixed. Well, that's frankly not the case. And again, drugs will always find a way to insert themselves into those sort of more desperate equations.
Absolutely. Caroline, we just discussed that the Syrian state under Assad became the largest Captagon producer in the world. But both Hezbollah in Lebanon and pro-Iran militias in Iraq have also been involved in the drug trade. How much has the Assad regime relied on these regional allies like Hezbollah, like the Hashd al-Sha'bi, for example, to support their Captagon trade? And how active are they still today?
Heavily, heavily. These were the primary supportive partners in the regime's Captagon and illicit industry. They played primarily supporting roles in the sense that they would also operate some small-scale production sites, in the Bekaa Valley, in the Kolomun mountain range, also provide access to ports. So, for example, we saw many seizures conducted at the, port of Beirut, for example. And that was just, really the tip of the iceberg that showed just how heavily the Syrian Captagon trade and illicit flows generally were intertwined with what was happening in Lebanon. As I mentioned, we've seen a spillover effect after the fall of the Assad regime. It's very clear that traffickers feel like there need to be new pockets that they can operate without the high level of threat, high threat of interdiction. One of those pockets that I expected many of these illicit networks to try and run to was in Lebanon, along the Syrian-Lebanese border. That being said, we're seeing a parallel process happen inside of Lebanon, where state security forces are feeling empowered. Their resourcing has also led to a slight uptick in interdictions. We've seen now raids where members of the Zaiter family, they've been killed by Lebanese security forces. We've already seen 2 laboratory raids in Lebanon, which is high compared to what we've seen on our seizure database. So it's very clear that in neighboring Lebanon, while there still is certainly consistent Captagon and illicit drug production, hashish is also, of course, a reality there. There is a slight crackdown that's happening with the Lebanese armed forces and Lebanese security forces, and their government is feeling slightly more empowered to go after these sorts of illicit networks. When it comes to the role of Iran-aligned networks and militias, we saw that very much in play in the south, in Suwaida and Dara, especially with reports from Jordanian armed forces that would continuously report sightings and evidence that Iran-backed militias were sometimes providing the equipment, such as sophisticated drones, helping arm some of these smugglers, because these smugglers were not just teenagers in backpacks. They, in some cases, engaged first in crossfire with Jordanian armed forces, showing that they very much adopted a kinetic component, and they were being advised and assisted by Iran-backed militias, in addition to the 4th Armored Division. Since then, we haven't necessarily seen their heavy presence in the south. But this certainly has helped facilitate the Captagon trade across the border into neighboring Iraq, where there continue to be reports of Iran-backed militias engaging in mostly trafficking of Captagon. We've seen some production sites, both in northern and southern Iraq. Not many production sites flagged, interestingly, in 2025, but in 2024, that was definitely something we saw at least 4 times, production sites interdicted in both northern and southern Iraq. Also, they facilitated the flow of Captagon into the Gulf, into Kuwait, where we saw 4 Captagon production sites flagged in the country in just 1 year. So I think it's very clear that when it comes to the actors that are inheriting illicit Captagon production, Iran-backed militias stand to benefit, and they certainly have the capabilities, they have the know-how, they have the networks. But then the question remains is, will they step up production and trafficking to the scale that the regime did before its fall in December 2024? I don't think they will, and I don't think that they can yet. I think that especially as, in the wake of October 7th and the regional war and escalation we've seen, I think that a lot of these networks, Iran-backed militias, they're trying to also lay low and identify ways of generating alternative revenue that doesn't necessarily put a target on their back. So that's why we've seen things very, very quiet in Iraq. It's why we've seen some activity in Lebanon, but also a crackdown. And it's also why we've seen this huge spillover into Yemen, both in Houthi-controlled areas and non-Houthi controlled areas of Yemen.
Charles?
I might
Anything
just jump in just to make a point on Lebanon that goes slightly wider than just the drugs trade, which is to say, yeah, I mean, at various times in the conversation we've talked about Syria's, developing bilateral relationships with its neighbors vis-a-vis the drugs trade. And I think when it comes to Lebanon, it is inescapably the fact that the drugs trade runs through certain clans that then have connectivity with a certain armed movement in Lebanon. That brings with it a certain historical animosity when it comes to the shape of the transitional government and the way that much of the Syrian population views things. And it is not a coincidence, therefore, that the relationship amongst all Syria's regional neighbors that Syria has struggled the most with over the last 10 months is Lebanon. It's also not a coincidence that when President al-Shara made his speech a few months ago after his meeting with President Trump and this very kind of hopeful period in Syria where he thanked every single regional state except Lebanon was not a coincidence. The fact that we are now seeing the entire Syrian-Lebanese relationship defined by talks focused only on the issue of getting Syrians out of Lebanese prisons, and there is no other bilateral relationship to be had still to this day, is because of this complex dynamic. And on the security side, coming closer to the issue of drugs, I mean, there have been attempts, mostly originally mediated by Saudi Arabia, to build confidence in the mill-to-mill and MOI to MOI relationship between Syria and Lebanon. Saudi played host to a number of bilateral security talks that tried to engender some confidence in the relationship. But I think it was Caroline who mentioned the clashes that we saw earlier in the year. I mean, one of the most unfortunate decisions made during those clashes was a public decision by General Aoun. And of course, he is viewed from Syria not just as the president, but also someone with a military history. He publicly decided to issue an order to the Lebanese armed forces to fire on any Syrian force across the border during those clashes that fired towards the Lebanese border. And of course, it was very well known that the only reason those clashes began was that smugglers in both arms and drugs were crossing from Lebanon into Syria. So the fact that we had a former military general who is now the president of Lebanon issuing a public order to fire at Syrian security forces for intercepting drug smugglers put a really big poison pill into that early relationship. And it's been very hard to get past that. And again, my meeting with the Interior Minister, but also with others underneath him who are running much more directly the day-to-day on these issues, was very, very clear. They have very little faith in the LAF and in Lebanon's leadership to be doing the right things. Now, whether that's conspiracy theories or not, perceptions are what drive the reality here. And the perception is Lebanon remains complicit as a state and through their security forces in the drugs and arms trade, which on the Syrian side, they're dealing with every single day. So again, whether that's fact or fiction doesn't really matter. The perception is Lebanon remains a really significant problem. And the fact that some of the biggest names in the drugs trade and arms trade and from the regime are still sat in Beirut in five-star hotels really adds to the problematic nature of that relationship too.
And just quickly to add, I think you can see it reflected in all of the tip-offs and interdictions that have been conducted around the region. For example, whenever there is a lab seizure, for example, there was a major lab seizure just a few months ago in Lebanon, and that was conducted with the assistance of the Iraqi government, not Syria. Lab interdictions that we've seen conducted in Syria, sometimes with tip-offs from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iraq, but we are never seeing that joint collaboration between Lebanon and Syria. Even the intelligence operation that the Syrian Interior Ministry conducted to get Wassim Badi al-Assad back into Syria was not closely conducted with the local Lebanese security forces, which is quite amazing given the fact that they used a double agent to lure him back in. But I think that also represents somewhat of a sore spot in the sense that this is a region that historically, especially during the regime era, was such an important porous corridor for drug trafficking. And you have families, in some cases, with both Syrian and Lebanese roots that have used this route, and there's practically no collaboration there, at least as of yet.
Absolutely. A question from me, and then I'm going to add another question from Marissa. What has been the role of the U.S. government in helping battle the Captagon trade, and how can it be improved going forward? Marissa wants to know, she has a question about the level of awareness, concern, interest on this Captagon issue amongst congressional leaders, and is there efforts to provide get more critical support to Syria, Jordan, Lebanon to combat trafficking? Caroline, we can start with you and then go to Charles.
Sure. I feel like, I think most that had been looking at Captagon had to take at least 24 hours after the fall of the Assad regime to get a good sense of where this is all going, and try to think like criminal syndicates, and understand exactly what sort of opportunities exist and what kind of landscape now exists for them to carry on this illicit trade. And, after that moment of reflection for me, and I think that Charles can agree, and many others that are following this issue, the Captagon trade is far from over. However, it's more complex now. It's more challenging in many ways, because now there's not this monopoly over at least 80% of production anchored in Syria. Everything is suspended in thin air right now. It's very much a transitionary period where we're starting to see small scale labs in far-flung places, not necessarily patterns that we're seeing concretely across the board, but signs that traffickers sense this new environment and are trying to exploit this new moment with an increase in prices and also the shortage in supply. And so as a result, I think that any sort of strategy conducted by the US as well as in the region should try and think with the big picture in mind. Number one, as Dr. Salul just mentioned, Captagon is, and I hate to use this word, but I feel like it does somewhat summarize Captagon's role. It's a gateway drug into other synthetic substances. It is an amphetamine type stimulant, just like methamphetamine. Methamphetamine uses the same synthesis process, the same precursors. They're chemical cousins. And so as a result, what we've seen is a surge in methamphetamine, specifically in crystal methamphetamine, across the region. My colleague Karam Shah and I, we work together to run the numbers every year, and we've seen, we put something on a graph to see methamphetamine and Captagon. Captagon is dipped in the region, and crystal methamphetamine has skyrocketed. It's a very concerning and steep and sharp spike. So as a result, I think any sort of strategy should look at both Captagon and methamphetamine flows, look at the actors involved. Many of the actors are now the same, and try and envision a Captagon strategy beyond Syria. There have been two waves of legislation from the United States, specifically on Captagon, first being with the Captagon Act, and then the second being with the Captagon Trafficking Suppression Act, introduced by Representative French Hill. Both, I think, were effective in shining a light on the Captagon trade, shining a light that the regime and Iran-backed militias played in both Lebanon and Syria. It also started the process of sanctions on these individuals that still might be heavily involved in Captagon production and or trafficking. But now I think it's time that we broaden this picture. We look beyond just Syria. We also have to update the language of it trying to counter the regime's role and the regime's use of the Captagon trade, and expand it beyond Syria into networks that are operating in Iraq, looking at the potential role that the Houthis are playing in Yemen, the rapid support forces in Sudan. We're really starting to see a diversification of actors and criminal syndicates when it comes to amphetamine type stimulants in the region. So I think as a result, we need to really look ahead and look at all of the new actors that are coming into the fold and trying to seize on this moment and how they might try and transfer this opportunity into a surge in crystal methamphetamine production and trafficking.
Absolutely. Charles?
Yeah, I would, to answer your question directly, and maybe a bit bluntly, I think a good amount of the US congressional attention that was built and generated around the Captagon issue had more to do with the drive by certain members of Congress to oppose Assad regime and find another way to get wider political and diplomatic attention on opposing the Assad regime than it had to do with Captagon itself. If it had everything to do with Captagon, we would be hearing from the same people, French Hill included, that, you know, Captagon remains a crucial issue that we have to continue to combat. We need new legislation to support the transitional government to combat the drug. We haven't had any of that. And so, you know, I think that obviously tells us a lot more about US congressional politics and what drives it than it does about Captagon or Syria. But it is what it is. We haven't seen, you know, with the exception of perhaps this event, almost any real public attention. Of course, you know, Caroline's reports, but I mean, in terms of events and gatherings and things, very little in the way of talking about this as a continued issue. And again, I think that's because a lot of people paid attention to it because of Bashar al-Assad. And much more to do with, you know, the drugs trade as a problem in and of itself. So I think there's, you know, responsibility, frankly, amongst those of us who do pay attention to drive forward the reality that Dr. Zahir made, which is that this is, you know, the ship has sailed. This is a major public health crisis that has long-term strategic effects. For Syria, yes, but as Caroline was just saying, for the rest of the region, particularly if it's shifting from Captagon, which is, you know, still a horrible drug, but nothing compared to crystal meth. And so, you know, that needs a lot more policy attention, given all of the long-term ripple effects that will have. And then just finally a note on US assistance, as much as there is any now to dealing with this issue, I think it's very, very minimal. Of course, US assistance continues to support Jordan in particular, Jordan's border security, on the military intelligence level, to continuing to monitor organized crime, transnational, transborder smuggling and trafficking. But I suspect there is less of an eye on terms of US assistance to this now that Assad has gone. I think there's just an assumption that this isn't as big a problem as it used to be. But I think it also bears worth saying that, just simply because I made such a big point of talking about Syria's interior ministry earlier, that on an intelligence level, the US has now a very solid working relationship with the Syrian Ministry of Interior. So yes, the support institutionally is coming from Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular. But again, as I've said in a similar closed setting for MEI, the Interior Minister basically said, every week my friends from the CIA are here in this office and we're discussing this and this and that. You know, he made no secret of the fact that he had a very open working relationship with the US intelligence community now. And I think 99% of that is directed to countering ISIS. But if there is a 1% on anything else, it is likely to still be on these legacy issues in terms of countering organized crime and how that may connect to things like Hezbollah and weapons smuggling and everything else.
Unfortunately, we've reached the end of today's webinar. Thank you to our audience for the great questions, and a huge thank you to our panelists, Caroline Rose and Charles Lister, for their time and valuable insight. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and we look forward to next time.